Well, I'm supposed to get us started. I want to thank Laura and Tomas. I'm Latinizing both of you guys. Bienvenidos a Los Angeles. Want to thank you both for the kind introduction, in which you called us intellectual giants. I feel more like, here's an intellectual giant, and here's his friend Manuelito. So, it's always a thrill to be in conversation with John. And what we got asked to do was to basically moderate each other in this conversation. I think they were trying to save money on the moderator, so they instead threw the task to us. And I was asked to say something to sort of get us started. And I wanted to comment on sort of something old and something new. Maybe later we'll talk about something borrowed and something blue. But the old is that this issue of displacement is in the very building in which we sit. You heard about this land being taken from the Tongva with that opening. But it's also important to realize that you're sitting on Bunker Hill. And Bunker Hill was a thriving neighborhood. Was originally one of the first suburbs of LA, when suburbs really were close. And in the post-World War II period, when there was an influx of residents into Los Angeles, this neighborhood, a lot of the big Victorian houses got cut up, and it was a place for a lot of rentals and tenements. And in 1955, the city of Los Angeles decided, in that sort of frame of urban renewal of that time, to decimate the neighborhood and to level Bunker Hill, not just level the buildings, but actually take the hill down so it instead become Bunker Bump instead of Bunker Hill, though it still has that name. And if you walk around, you'll see what they did, which was also to kill the neighborhood in so many other ways too. So if you walk on the streets, God forbid, in this area of town, cars are whizzing by, there's concrete facing the streets. The life was sucked out of the neighborhood. So this issue of gentrification and displacement, you're sitting in the living embodiment of it with this hotel in this neighborhood. Of course, there's something new as well. And the something new is the sort of wave of gentrification and displacement that's coming to LA that's being driven, I think, by sort of three fundamental forces that we need to be paying attention to. One is the shifting economy in two ways. One is the sort of creative economy and the thriving of the downtown, in part because of the creative economy. Another is just the tremendous inequality in income, which has meant that people are able to buy 1 and 2 houses or 1 and 2 apartments and displace people easily. A second is kind of demographic change, and by this, more young people staying in our downtowns. And then the third is something that we're not kind of used to. A lot of people who do community development are used to not being successful. So, we've wanted to kind of turn around our cities for years, and we thought, we're not really going to be successful, but we really want to turn around our cities. And all of a sudden, a lot of success is coming. The cities are reviving, and we don't really know what to do with success. We didn't prepare for it, because that's not how we progressives roll. We're not used to winning. And so now we have to deal with the fact that some of the success has also meant displacement through gentrification and change. We'll talk much more about these issues. But John, from your perspective, when you think about something old and something new, what is it about the moment that we're in that is like the long history of racism and displacement in our society? And what about it is new and different that we need to be paying attention to?
Well, first of all, I want to join with Manuel in sort of thanking the host and SPARCC for inviting us here. But I thought we were getting paid a lot. So, they weren't going to save any money. All the money we saved, they can give to us. But anyway.
You must have gotten a different email.
Yeah, exactly. So I thought this about investing wealth in, anyway. So if you think about, think about it really. These issues are with us almost as long as we can remember. We're sitting here on native land, so we're the native people who are here. And we're talking about displacements. We're talking about displacements of largely, not exclusively, but largely blacks and Latinos. So we're not in Africa, we're maybe in Mexico, but these processes of actually moving people and sorting people based on race, based on economics is certainly as old as colonialization. It's certainly as old as white people. In fact, I would say that's what whiteness is about. It's about actually the organization of space. And these issues are not just in the United States. There's this whole fight about whether England is going to leave Europe. And really, the heart of one of those issues is the English people feel like there are too many people who are not English in England. Which is interesting, because if you want to see, talking about something old, if you want to see Egyptian art, you don't go to Egypt, you go to London. I'm serious. And so when the people decide to follow their art, to follow their culture, it's like, I want to see where we came from. Let's go to London. It's like, no, you can't come here. This is just for the English. So I think that this process of actually sorting people and resources is really old. And what's new is that the speed with which it's happening. And what you have now is that, especially here in California, but not just in California, in any major city in the United States, and certainly in most of the SPARCC places where they're working, you have sort of a cultural expression. In urban areas, we have a whole other thing with rural areas. You have the cultural expression of, I have black friends, I have white friends, I have gay friends, but they can't live in my neighborhood. So you have the expression of inclusion, but the practice of exclusion. So that's new, because in the 50s and 60s, the expression and the exclusion was aligned. We called it segregation, we called it Jim Crow. But now in San Francisco, which has fewer than 4% of people living in San Francisco is African American, and at one point San Francisco had the largest number of African Americans of any city west of the Mississippi. And San Francisco is a very open, welcoming city, unless you're black. And then the last thing I'll say, and I shared this with Manuel. So I drive a Tesla, and I teach at UC Berkeley, and I'm an endowed professor. And I'm old, and I have a limp, and I have, a bunch of other stuff that you really don't want to hear. But I'm driving into the parking lot for UC Berkeley, and a woman is there, and she doesn't work there. She's just parking there. And as I'm pulling into the parking lot, she puts her body in front of the car and says, Sir, this lot is just for UC Berkeley faculty and staff. Now think about this. She's saying, now here's this old black guy in this Tesla, and she's saying, we have thousands of faculty and staff, but she's saying, I know for a fact that you don't belong here, right? And I said, it's all right. I work here. And you have that expression in Starbucks. You have that expression at Yale. You have that expression in parks. You have that expression. And so there's this sorting in society that's actually even more extreme. And so now you are getting a realignment with Trump in the White House of basically saying some space is for some people and not for other people. And it's not evenly distributed based on income. It's not evenly distributed based on race. So that's the environment that we're dealing with now.
So parking lot Becky.
And I had this momentary thought, what would happen if the car was to, just sort of involuntarily accelerate while she's standing in front of it? No. I didn't think of that.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons why I drive a Chevrolet Bolt instead of the Tesla, so I can park anywhere. So these are big issues. What do you see in terms of some of the new solutions and some of the limits? I have a lot of interest in this as an academic. as a person in solidarity with community organizations, and also as the father of a son who is a musician, whose backup career is as an actor, and who lives in Echo Park, and boy, that's like going. So when we start to think about the solutions that people are often proposing to deal with some of the current pressures of gentrification and displacement, the community land trust solutions, the building of affordable housing, the even inclusionary zoning. These all seem so short of the fundamental problem. In a way, the forces running away from us in these tools seem so limited. Is that a function of the limits of our imagination and our need to think about other kinds of ways of thinking about housing?
I think it is, and I also go back to your earlier point. I think sometimes, and I say to my staff oftentimes, don't define what you do by your expertise, but by the nature of the problem. And I think oftentimes we define what we do by our own capacity. And so, you know, it's as hard as the land trust is, as hard as exclusionary zoning is, it's manageable. But when you think of the housing market and the real estate market as a global market, as primarily a credit market, I was saying to Manuel that at breakfast, I think the data is that 20% of the wealth in the world is invested in real estate. And we're talking, that's multi-trillions of dollars. And most of us feel like, oh, that's too big. You know, so I'm not going to deal with that big thing. I'll deal with this small thing. It's like going to a doctor and you tell the doctor, you know, I think I have cancer and a heart condition. The doctor says, I can't fix that, but I can get that splinter out of your hand. And the splinter is irritating, so it's nice to have the splinter removed from your hand, but it doesn't do anything for the cancer and heart condition. And so I think that we actually focus narrowly because of our own expertise and own capacity. And yet, it's nice to see, and to the credit of SPARCC, that you're leaning into the question of race. And from my perspective, and I don't know enough about all the stuff you're doing, although I'm on the advisory committee, I'd say leaning in, not grabbing it. And to grab it, it becomes like bigger than a heart attack and bigger than cancer. I mean, race and the role of race in all this, I think, is phenomenal. And in many ways, although it doesn't just affect black people or Latinos, it affects the entire structure of the market. So I would encourage, sort of, even while we do our sort of individual discrete projects, to link it to something larger and affirmative. It's not going to fix itself by itself. The market is changing very fast, so we have to be able to change as well. But what about you, Manuel? Since I'm part of this interviewing team, what do you see as, and it's interesting because you live in LA, and LA is very different than Detroit. Detroit is very different than San Francisco. San Francisco is very different than Memphis, Atlanta. So you have these 6 sites, and I assume they picked the sites because they were different. So what does that difference mean? And yet there's this current throughout this difference of displacement, of gentrification. And I said to Manuel, I was kind of shocked initially, and I was wrong, which happened one other time, I think it was 1953. I didn't think there would be displacement in Detroit, because you have 100,000 vacant units in Detroit. So you can bring in a lot of people without displacement. We are having serious displacement in Detroit, and you still have 100,000 vacant lots. So how do you actually square this?
So there were about 10 questions in there. So let me do the academic thing of pretending to answer the question you asked, and instead answering a slightly different question. It's a good academic trick. And then loop back to the question, because I think one of the fundamental things is the way in which we think about housing as a market phenomena rather than as a human right. And so when you think about it as a housing phenomena, then the tools are very limited. And you don't go to say, gosh, we need social housing. If it's good enough for Singapore and Hong Kong, why is it not good enough for us? You don't say we actually need to use strict rent control because that would interfere with the market. And I think one of the things that we really need to do in terms of sort of moving away from the limits on the tools is to begin to make the same kind of move that's been made around healthcare, that we think that health is so important. We're not going to leave it up to the market to see whether or not somebody gets healthcare. And we haven't completely convinced everyone, but that's been a fundamental shift in the way we think about it in the world and in the United States even now. And I think we need to make the same kind of move with regard to that in housing. And I think that's its sort of fundamental task. Looping back to the question you did ask, I do think that in all 6 of these places, the common denominator, the reason why displacement could happen in Detroit is because displacement and gentrification is fundamentally about power. It's not about market forces. It's about whether or not you've got power in the markets. If you had assets, people couldn't displace you. And it's whether or not you've got power over public policy. And it's also whether or not you've got power over the meaning of a place. So one of the things I think people don't pay enough attention to with the issues of gentrification and displacement is the erasure of cultural meaning of particular locations. So a neighborhood that was sort of fundamental to defining the Black experience in a particular city in Los Angeles, that's Leimert Park, for example, in South LA. When that changes, it's also a sense of cultural loss. When East LA and Boyle Heights shift, that sort of center, I mean, people forget that in 1970, 15% of all Latinos in the United States lived in LA County. Probably almost all of them in Boyle Heights, most of them with Isela's family. So this is a significant cultural, marker, and when the meaning of the place changes. So it's power over the market, it's power over policy, and it's power over culture and meaning of a place as well. And I think that's while it plays out differently in a Detroit than it does in an LA, it's fundamentally about power. And the mistake you made in Detroit, which you're right, is the only mistake I've ever heard you making. It's interesting. We were at a panel about a year and a half ago, and somebody was moderating this panel. It was a journalist. It was sort of like journalist Becky too, in the way the person understood some of these issues, and basically, said, well, we're getting gentrification in Highland Park and in Echo Park and places like that, but certainly not in South LA. There were a lot of people in South LA who raised their hand and went, what the, right? You can finish that sentence. And because what people don't understand is the displacement that's going on there now because, again, of success. There's been this big investment. We decided to tax ourselves to lay out transit. So now we've got a great transit line that runs all the way from downtown LA to Santa Monica. Those of you who come to Los Angeles and think it's only a place for cars, get out of those cars and take some of this transit. It's wonderful. But what it's doing, and this is the interaction with the history that you're talking about, is people now are taking that transit line and they're beginning to understand something about South LA, which is really significant. And for those of you who are visiting here, I urge you to take a look at this. For those of you from Los Angeles, you understand this. If you go through South LA and you go on the boulevards, for the most part, the boulevards are tattered. There's been very little public investment and private investment. But now that's coming because of the rail line. If you go one block in from those boulevards into the areas where there are homes, those homes are so well maintained and there's so much pride. I remember visiting a friend in South LA about a decade ago and walking around with him. And I said, I could never live here. And he said, why? This is a beautiful neighborhood. I said, I could never keep my lawn as nicely as everybody in your neighborhood. I'd be booted out, right? I'd have to find myself a gardener for sure. But the place is so well maintained and all of a sudden people are seeing that, this disjuncture between the private pride of people in their neighborhood and the way in which it's been disinvested in for years. And now that the investment is starting to roll through, housing prices are skyrocketing, people are feeling the threat. And on the other hand, you also have older African Americans who are living in big houses who are saying, well, this is my opportunity to cash out and be able to live comfortably for the rest of my life. So I think this takes different forms in different places, but it's really the same thread. The question I want to ask you, John, is what does it mean for you, and I'll answer this, I'll ask myself this question too, very creative. What does it mean for you to lead with racial equity? SPARCC is saying that that's something that they want to do. What does it mean concretely beyond saying we're going to lead with racial equity?
Well, it's a great question. And there's this trick that academics use, that when people ask a question, they take the question. So I'm going to answer a different question.
This is a great conversation for sure, yeah.
And then I'll come back to your question.
Yeah.
I'm a quick learner. But anyway, so one of the things about displacement that's interesting is, where do the people go? We talk about displacement, and it's like, oh, they left the place. So where'd they go? And so part of the, I guess the picture has to be an understanding of the entire movement. And what we don't know everything about this. In fact, we know very little, because we don't want to know. And sometimes we're deliberately ignorant. It's like, oh, all the Latinos left. Where'd they go? I don't know. Maybe back to Mexico. Maybe, I don't know. They just left. Where people usually go is worse off than where they are. So it's not just displacement. It's not just losing your neighborhood, which is bad enough, losing your community and culture, which is bad enough, but where you land. And so as the introducer suggests, we do opportunity-based mapping. So we look at the distribution of opportunity. And so part of the dynamics is that people are being displaced from opportunity, a whole range of opportunities. And in terms of trying to decide or help people get tattered in a positive way, you want it to be connected to opportunity. So part of what leading with racial equity for me means a couple of things. First, it means getting and disaggregating the data. So a lot of times we don't know. It's like poor people say, well, poor people experience is different if they're black, if they're Latino, if they're white, and they're radically different. And we have policies, even when you talk about power, the effort to actually disempower people of color. We talked a little bit about the census, gerrymandering. It's like all of these efforts. And part of the thing I think that we have to deal with is that as people of color, and particularly black people, get power, there's a lot of society that says that's not legitimate. And so literally, there was a woman in Louisiana who said that when she woke up the day after the election, when Obama was elected, and found that he was president, she couldn't get out of bed for 2 weeks. And she was basically saying, what the F, a black person in the White House and they're not in the kitchen? And so in a sense, part of what I see is a lack of willingness to share power and a sort of this huge fight about power, who really belongs. And so racial equity to me is to really name that. But the equity part of racial equity is to name it in a way that's actually inclusive of all. And I think and I have a video on this because I think part of what happened in reaction to sort of, the forward white thrust, the reassertion of white space and white identity, the reassertion of a space of you don't belong. So that sort of two reactions. One is just to withdraw. It's like, okay, you don't want me here at Berkeley, I'll go to UCLA. Oops, wait a minute, that's not any better than Berkeley. And so a lot of blacks, and certainly black students, choose not to go to these traditionally historically white colleges. It's like the experience there is so terrible. That to me is the inadequate response. And so that's one response. But the other is just to define a future without white people. And by that I mean, it's like we sort of think about, Steve Phillips wrote a book, The Brown is the New White. It's like, when we are the majority, look out, y'all. And of course, that's understandable, but it's not appropriate. And so equity to me is to not falsely equate people, the black experience, the white experience, the Latino experience, but to actually envision a way of actually getting everyone there to this future where we all belong, and understanding that different people and different communities will need different things. And I call that targeted universalism. So it really does require coming together and then confronting the white hegemony, and I don't mean whiteness in terms of color, but in terms of power structure, in terms of identity. And I'll end by just saying that someone talked about, there's an article in the Atlantic talked about tribalism that's happening in the United States today. And they say, this is not tribalism. Because on one side, you have essentially conservative, reactionary white people. On the other side, you have blacks, Latinos, Asian, gays, progressive whites. That's not a tribe. So it's like you have this one group that's organized around white supremacy and everybody else. So how's that tribalism? So anyway, I think
that's like a tribe and a posse.
Exactly.
So it's another academic trick, because that was such a good example, is that I will be using that in the future in my speeches. And the first time I use it, I will credit John Powell. The second time, I'll probably forget to credit John Powell. And then the third time, I will say, as I have long said. So I want to do kind of one thing on the race equity, and then leading with racial equity, and then maybe try to shift us a little bit to what does it mean to build successful partnerships. But I think you've covered the range of things. The one thing I would say is that leading on racial equity, leading with racial equity in mind, means talking about it constantly. Because I think what happens is that people, I mean, obviously you and I are modeling being comfortable talking about it, but I think people wind up thinking that's not something you should be talking about in the middle of pulling your, capital campaign together.
And by people, you mean white people, I assume. No, not just white people.
No, I don't think it's just white people. I think white people are afraid of talking about it because people are afraid they might make a misstep. People of color are often not comfortable talking about it because we don't want it to be the only prism through which you see our experience or interpret what we're saying. I think people are generally uncomfortable. So just get comfortable. And what I've been telling folks recently is the following. How many of you go to the gym regularly? Okay, my good friend Rudy's going,
What do you mean by regular?
What do you mean regularly? Like,
what do you mean gym?
Yeah, like, how does once a year work for you, brother? Yeah. How many of you go pretty irregularly, like just every once in a while? Okay, a couple of people admitting it, right? Every time you go when you haven't been for a very long time, it's very painful, right? You make mistakes, you drop weights on yourself, things hurt at the end. That's like when you don't talk about race. If you talk about race every day and in every conversation, you'll get some skills. You'll make some mistakes, but it'll be a kind of practice. And so one of the things I think to take away is how do you, in every conversation you're having, sort of bring this in where it makes sense. So, John, what kind of thoughts do you have? Everybody's trying to form partnerships on these issues, and it actually is a series of unusual actors because it's sort of community-based actors, some folks very based in services, some folks very based in social movements. It's foundations. It's also trying to bring bankers into the picture. When you think about these kind of partnerships of unusual actors, what words of advice do you have?
Well, my one word of advice I'd have is that go to the gym more often. Look, the thing with partnerships, and Manuel and I talked about this earlier, the thing with partnerships, they're messy. Some of you may be married, some of you may not be married, some of you may want to not be married. But if you have a relationship, any serious relationship, it's actually very messy. And it's multi-directional. It's not one-directional. And so I was talking to some of the SPARCC people, and I was saying, it's great you go into the community and sort of say you want the community to have a voice in terms of their own life, and so you have this partnership. But do they have a voice in terms of what the foundation is doing outside of the community, how it's actually investing its money? So I got called by Starbucks after the two brothers there got arrested. And I was part of that team of people who were trying to advise. And when they first called, I mean, to their credit, they were saying, we haven't been to the gym very often, but we're trying to go now. How do we talk about race? How do we do this? How do we do it right? And I said, so it's not just what happens in that store, it's where do you invest your money? And who advises you? We talked about pension funds. Who's the advisors? Pension funds across the country are incredibly white and male. And so if you have a partnership, it has to be, from my perspective, multi-directional. It can't be just, we're bringing something to you and we want you to have a voice in it. It's that, can we tell you about this other things you're doing? I'll give you one concrete example. And I'll use the name, it's probably not appropriate, but I'll use it anyway. One of the first grants I got was from the Otto Bremer Foundation in Minnesota. And it was to deal with housing, the same issues. And this was 30 years ago. And we started digging and digging and digging and digging. What can we do? Can we do this? Can we do this? And then finally I found out that almost a substantial number of the mortgages that were held in Minnesota was held by the Otto Bremer Bank. And I said, oh, wow. So maybe let's go talk to the bank about its lending practices. And the foundation says, don't go there. So we give our little thing here to sort of work on the problems that we create, but you can't talk to the bank. It's not that I couldn't convince the bank, I couldn't even talk to the bank. So what kind of partnership is that? So I think, again, partnership has to be really multi-directional and everything's on the table. The last thing I would say, and this is hard and interesting, it's not just the community. What's happening is happening in the whole country. And so it can't be, how do you actually save East Oakland, as opposed to how do you save Oakland in the Bay Area? All these things are interrelated. And so they have to be put together. Everything has to be put on the table. It's not just me influencing my community in East Oakland. It's also influencing what's happening in Palo Alto. It's influencing what's happening at Facebook, influencing what's happening with Amazon. It's actually a much larger picture. So I think of a partnership as a lot of things on the table, messy, and that it's multi-directional. How about you? How do you think about these things?
I was actually thinking of the next question I was going to ask you, which shows I was probably engaged. So I'll ask this question and answer it myself, and then go to you. Because the question I was going to ask you is, what's the most sort of, and I think it gets at partnership, exciting thing that you're seeing going on right now around these issues? And frankly, I would kind of lift up our partners in ACT LA, because I think there's something just wonderful going on in California. After all, in this last election, Orange County turned blue. That is the first time since the dawn of man. So it's pretty exciting. But what's interesting is this kind of sense of empowerment, right? That all of a sudden the state's on the cusp of real change, not just repairing the damage. That in Los Angeles, that much of what we've done is kind of repair problems that have been there before, raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, or begin to do things. And now there's much more of a sense of anticipating what's going to go on. Not just being battered by the investment, but saying, my gosh, that's where the transit dollars are going. That's where the park money is going. What do we actually need to do to get ahead of that with new metrics around equity, with new capacities for community-based organizations to be parts of the conversation? So it's really exciting to me, it's a little hometown enthusiasm, is seeing that shift. And I think it's a kind of fundamental shift, because I think, as part of a group that got formed in the late 1980s in Los Angeles that was called the New Majority Task Force. And it was a group of African American and Latino and Asian Pacific American leaders, civic leaders, urban planners, and others who kind of realized that the city had just become majority people of color. And that what that meant was that so-called minorities shouldn't act like minorities. That is, you shouldn't react to what people are delivering. You should be a majority and propose what's about to happen. And I have this kind of same sense that a lot of our community-based organizations, Learn just won this fantastic victory for street vending here in Los Angeles. Let's give that a big round of applause. That enlivens our streetscapes, that allows people to claim their cultural space, and it allows people who are undocumented Californians, because make no mistake about it, they're Californians, even if they don't have papers, to be in the United States. It allows them to craft a living, have some autonomy, gain some assets, et cetera. So there's this really exciting moment of beginning to actually propose and act and kind of get ahead of things. And so I'm so excited about that happening here. What's exciting, and that's a reflection of partnerships and a reflection of also trying to partner, watching a very difficult set of partnerships emerge between community-based organizations and Metro, the transit agency, which has historically mauled over communities, but is now more open, and people trying to figure out how to form those relationships. It's very, very exciting. What's exciting you as you look around the country?
Well, there are a number of things that are exciting, and let me continue our dance by answering another question or statement. And I sort of suggested this, but I want to put a pin in it because I think it's really important. So I think as we sort of change in terms of demographics, the word majority and minority will go away. It won't be that one group is a minority. Well, actually, we have a new nomenclature. That nomenclature actually never made sense, but it won't make sense in the future. But I do think as people who are progressive and inclusive actually become the power center of this country, they will have to do it for everyone. So I would have actually preferred, when you talked about the new majority, for whites to be in that majority. So the future has to contain whites. We're not going to, so the white thing has been to erase Native Americans, to erase Latinos, to erase blacks. As we sort of gain numbers and power, it's not to erase whites, it's to erase whiteness, but not white people. There has to be a space for them, both in the cities and in rural America. So that's one. I mean, and that's a complicated thing that I could spend some time in. And I'm excited about a lot of things. I mean, I played basketball going into college, and the Lakers just got a new player. That's kind of exciting. Even though he left Cleveland, which I spent some time in Ohio. But I think we're in this really incredibly intense dance in the United States and in the world. The old will not hold, both in terms of people and in terms of institutions. And it will go to the far to the right or far to the left. And for the foreseeable future, it will not be stable. So the right may win for election cycle, or the left may win for, but I think we actually need a very different paradigm. And to me, to watch people starting to sort of see that, even in the early seeds, that's exciting. And it's exciting for people to sort of begin to link up the environment, migration, technology, all these things in a much more, to tell a different story about those things and people in that. Now, it's too early to really be excited because it's not clear we're going to win. It's not clear, as our host suggested, that Mother Earth will survive or that we will survive. But it's actually exciting that we're actually starting to talk about it in a different way.
Great. So I'm looking at our clock, and some of you know me know that I operate by what I call reglas pastoristas, pastorian rules, which is you can start hora latina, but you end on time. So we each have about a minute. One last thought you'd like to leave this group with?
Well, to be proactive, to sort of not, and Manuel, you said it earlier, sort of we sometimes have a set of rules and assumptions, and then we act in that. And that makes sense because sometimes things are hard to change. But when those rules and assumptions are problematic themselves, you got to actually develop some new rules and assumptions. You got to develop new stories, new laws, so that's the one thing I want to suggest to you, is that not accept the market as it is. Actually, the market's changing. The market today is not the same market in the 1970s, but we haven't participated in that change. We've been a victim of that change. Can we imagine a market where we participate in a market that actually would serve people, that would serve all of us? And we begin to see each other in different ways. And I think we have some expressions of that, and I would like to see that go up a couple of notches.
Great. And then I guess the thing I would leave with, it's sort of two things. I'm actually understand the moment of uncertainty that we're in that you're talking about, and yet I feel so assured that we will come out on the other end in better shape. And I do that kind of based on the California experience. I mean, what I like to say is I think that the United States just went through its Prop 187 moment, sort of a freak out around undocumented immigrants, which is what drove Prop 187, the ballot measure in 1994 that stripped away services, including educational services, from undocumented immigrants in California. But what people forget about California is in the early 1990s, we also suffered half of the country's net job losses from that recession because it was driven by the reduction in defense spending, and that really nailed our aerospace. And that Rush Limbaugh began his talk radio career in the late 1980s in California. So that perfect combination of demographic uncertainty or demographic anxiety, economic uncertainty, and profiteering from political polarization, we did it first. And 25 years later, there's been a fundamental transformation of the politics. So I'm optimistic because of that, but we haven't got 25 years. And so I want to close, actually, I usually close by quoting singers. So in this case, I'm going to quote Anderson .Paak. For those of you do not know Anderson .Paak, you are just not with it. He's, I like to say, he's black and Korean and all LA. It's kind of this weird mix mash of hip hop and funk and R&B. Got a brand new album called Oxnard, which is where he grew up. His first album was Venice, Malibu, Oxnard. Eventually, he'll wind up in Berkeley. But there's a number of good songs on that album, but one of them is one called 6 Summers. And it's about violence in his community. And at the end of the song, he goes, "Pop, pop, pop goes the shooter. Reform should have come much sooner. Pop, pop, pop goes the shooter. Reform should have come much sooner." We got to get a handle on this gentrification and displacement issue, or we're going to lose these communities, their cultures, this space for such important communities, for our communities in the cities. So let's make sure that in the work you do, making sure that these individual projects move forward, that communities get changed building by building or block by block, that you're making sure that reform comes much sooner. Thank you.